Sean, I got my headphones in. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, Michael. Good to see you.
So give us a sense. I mean, we all heard back in the day, the New York Post reported on a bunch of this stuff, that this woman, Patrice Coolers, one of many people involved in this, had bought, I think, 4 houses. I mean, give us a little sense of what happened here, because I know that they took in a lot of money over a very short period of time, and you looked into it. Like, what did you discover?
Yeah, it was sort of a historic amount of money in a very short period of time. It's hard to remember if we go back to 2020, the protests after George Floyd's death. That year, Black Lives Matter accumulated $90 million in donations. There's been reports like the one you mentioned of where that money has gone. A lot of it is still unaccounted for. We're not sure where all of it actually is. And this is sort of gets to, I think, the news peg here. There's 2 recent issues that have come up with the movement and the various satellite organizations. And I think we can, dive into those and then kind of zoom back out and see what that kind of implies for the movement itself. On October 3rd, Sir Major Page, who was the controversial chapter head of BLM Atlanta, was sentenced to a 42-month federal prison stint for money laundering and embezzlement. He had taken what was about 18,000 donations worth about $450,000 and spent it largely on himself. He had bought a house. He had paid off some expensive bar tabs, tailored suits, some wild nights out. And I think that, going back to that 2020 period, it's sort of funny to think about how widely BLM had penetrated the social consciousness, and it was just sort of omnipresent and everywhere. And and it's funny to think now, 4 years later, that there's almost no mention of what happened in Atlanta. There's no mention in the press about where that money had went and how it was spent. On Monday, the BLM grassroots group, which is a kind of a splinter organization from the larger group, has to turn in tax filings to the California Attorney General, or they risk losing their tax-exempt status as a charity. Yeah. Part of the reason why that's significant is that filing will inform us where about $8.7 million of that $90 million had went. It's unaccounted for. And it's with that organization. So we can kind of get into the nuts and bolts of these different organizations and why there's so many of them and what had happened to them. But I think both of these, both Atlanta and both what's happening with BLM grassroots, speak to the lack of scrutiny that's happening right now in the legacy press, which is, kind of asymmetrical to the amount of attention that these groups got 3 or 4 years ago when all of those donations were coming in.
I want to be kind of as generous as I can to people and not presume bad faith. I mean, when you looked at this stuff, did you also see places that money was being spent well? I mean, obviously, we have a lot of news stories that come out because the stuff that makes news is the bad stuff. I mean, a lot of money came into the BLM organization. I mean, was some of that money that you saw, that you see in tax filings, distributed to, good causes and decent causes too?
I think for sure. And I think a lot of that money went to, was well spent. And I think that, the organization was structured so that it was sort of a loose leadership, and then there's all these chapter organizations. And as all that money came in, it came in very quickly. And I think, any organization that suddenly was infused with $90 million is going to struggle with how to manage it and how to organize it and how to disperse it. And I think you can give a lot of leeway for that. And I think that, even the chapters themselves, there were dozens of chapters around the country, most of them are still active. They themselves said, look, we just want some of the money to run events and to do local reach out. And they did over time get that money. And they did, I think certain chapters were better well organized, and they were able to kind of, use what they were given and make a difference locally. But systemically across the whole organization, I think that there were so many issues, and especially at the top where the money was handled, it starts to kind of strain. It's tough to be so generous after a while. I think that the comment that came out of the organization was that we were trying to fly the plane while we were building it, and I think that's probably a fair comment. But at the same time, while there was scrutiny of some of the money being spent for a $6 million mansion in Los Angeles in Studio City, there was a New York Magazine reporter who was talking with the leaders at that time, and he had obtained text messages and messages shared between the leadership. The same folks that were saying that we're having trouble building the plane while we're flying it were saying, how do we get out in front of this story? How do we kill it? How do we remove the fact that we're also using it for birthday parties and, we're crashing at the place? And, I think that they were very savvy about, how it was being perceived in the press. And I think that kind of back to that larger point, the press's role in this instance is to hold power and money to account. It's sort of basic fundamental tenet, right? And I think that if an organization has that much influence and power over the course of a year, and you spend a lot of time, documenting that the accumulation of that power in that influence, you also have to hold them to account. And I think it's fair to ask a lot of questions about where that money went and how it was used.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, you document some of this. I mean, some of it was really egregious, too. I mean, you can imagine someone taking a couple too many Ubers or expensing too many dinners. But as you mentioned, I mean, you're talking about a $6 million mansion. You also mentioned that there's a kind of adjunct mansion in Canada, the Canadian $4 million mansion. It's like, what is the justification for this stuff that is given? And is that stuff actually still in the hands of people who were in the leadership? Or has that, once under scrutiny, that, they had to sell it off or be a little accountable? I mean, it's incredible how sort of over the top some of these purchases are.
Yeah, I think that, so it gets a little knotty in terms of unpacking what the satellite of organizations are. When BLM started, they were known as BLM Global Foundation, and at some point, one of the leaders of a local chapter, there was a lot of frustration with how that money was being spent, and a leader there splintered off and took about 30 of the local chapters and formed BLM Grassroots. And so you have global and grassroots, and there's been lawsuits between the two of them over the money. And then there's also been this group called the Tides Foundation, which is a very large charity kind of pass-through organization that helps smaller charities manage their money and disperse their money. And some amount of money is still sitting with Tides, and there's a lawsuit between Tides and BLM Global. So it gets very confusing. It's very hard to kind of track where all the money went. But there have been some incredible purchases, I think, are worthy of scrutiny. And one is that the mansion you mentioned in Toronto. And I think that, you go back to 2020 and there's tens of thousands of people, sending in $5, $10, $50 to the movement. They're watching protests on TV, online, whatever. And I just, the mansion you mentioned, it's a Victorian mansion in downtown Toronto, a beautiful mansion that was converted into basically a kind of performative art space. And with residencies and all like for visiting artists. And it's tough to imagine when people were sending the money then that they anticipated that was where it was going to end up going. Remember the kind of core tenet of the movement was defund the police. And I think that a lot of the effort and a lot of the money that was spent has gotten really far away from that original intent.
All right, Sean, thank you so much, Sean Patrick Cooper, for being here. Check out his piece over at thefp.com. It's pretty sobering. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.